My name is Shai Secunda. I'm a professor of Judaism at Bard College, and I also direct the study of religion at the college. And I'm here in conversation with President Leon Botstein, and we're going to talk about religion and the way it intersects in the study of religion, the way it intersects with global crises, catastrophes, and pandemics included. I just wanted to say a few words about the study of religion at Bard. Bard has historically had a serious commitment to the study of religion, and in the last few decades has created a very symmetrical, almost, treatment of five major world traditions. Not only Western religions such as Christianity and Judaism, but we are also committed to the study of Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism. In fact, we have 5 faculty members that cover these different areas. We recently actually changed our name officially from the religion program to the interdisciplinary study of religions program. And in this way, we signal that our commitment to the study of religion is such that we recognize its multivalence, its various dimensions in terms of organizing society as a site of inspiration, artistic creation, and many other things. We also have faculty members who have and continue to work on topics closely related to the unfortunate matter at hand, though in the positive sense. 2 faculty members have studied and have taught about science and religion, and we do hope that science and expect science will not only guide us through this crisis, but also hopefully allow us to find a cure. Science and religion are often seen as in conflict, and they have been when it comes to matters like this. There have been religious figures who have said, frankly, dangerous things in times of pandemic. But there's a much more complicated relationship. So David Nelson, who serves as the rabbinic, the Jewish chaplain on campus, has a commitment to in teaching the study of technology, science, and religion. And Bruce Chilton, who teaches Christianity here at Bard, is currently co-teaching a course with a professor in biology, John Ferguson, devoted to evolution. And fittingly, the course takes place not only in the laboratory, where evolution can be studied with scientific glasses, but also in the seminar room, where it can be informed by the study of religion and the history of religion and evolution. You know, this moment is a moment in which we've found that religious people have reacted in various ways to the pandemic. Some of those ways have been dangerous. And this is because religion serves as one of the strongest forms of social cohesion to this day. Even in what many thought would have been a post-religious society, religion continues to be a rallying point for people, and that often means physical proximity. So recently in Israel, there were legal concerns about Jews gathering in prayer as they are wont to do, and great effort was taken to work with religious authorities to figure out how best to avoid the physical manifestation of this principle. And in the United States as well, there had been recent calls and pushback as well around the holiday of Easter. So religion has this function of gathering people together, and that can be dangerous. But we've also seen how, because it remains one of the last sites of social cohesion here in the United States and around the world, we've seen how it has been a source of comfort, both using technology so people can connect that way, but also in the privacy of one's home, to be able to connect to religious teachings and religious texts because of this shared sort of collective history has been effective. One of the greatest examples I can think of in the American context of the soul, the lonely individual engaged in this sort of activity is Allen Ginsberg and his poem Kaddish. Kaddish is a Jewish prayer that declares the magnificence of God. And since the Middle Ages, it's been a prayer that's recited upon mourning at a funeral and then in the months beyond that. And normally, it is recited in a quorum of 10 people at least. But in this poem, Ginsberg uses this ancient Jewish text written in Aramaic to think through and work through what Freud would call the work of mourning, using this ancient text. Now, Leon, I wanted to ask you, as someone who is both a proud Jew, but would certainly not define themselves as Orthodox, how you conceive of the social aspect of religion and what it might mean, even for someone who doesn't see themselves as religious. Leon, I think you're muted.
Yes, that's a rare instance for a college president to be muted, right? Maybe it should be happen more often. Anyway, but I was beginning to say that I want to thank you for your leadership of the now changed name of the study of religion, and for people tuning into this conversation. Shai is a very distinguished scholar whose interests extend to also the study of Zoroastrianism. So it's not only narrowly about one religion. And he has a talent which we value in our faculty at Bard. He is a major figure in a scholarly community where the readership is relatively restricted to people who know what's at stake or the controversies or the literature. But he also, I really first came across him and was enthusiastic about our recruiting him for the Neusner chair that he holds, because he writes for a journal called the Jewish Review of Books, published by Abe Soker. And someone said they thought there was already a Jewish Review of Books. Of course, that was a funny reference to the New York Review of Books. But it's an excellent publication, and it does focus on both scholarly and political and theological questions in a way that's readable by a layperson. In other words, you don't have to be a scholar, as Shai knows. Among Jews, learning is a form of prayer, and the amount of learning one can do within the Jewish tradition, just narrowly conceived, is relatively inexhaustible, and which means that there is a sense that one could develop a kind of a snobbery about communicating with people who, like myself, whose level of knowledge from within one tradition is quite limited. But to turn to your basic question, my sense of religion is complicated by the fact that many of us did grow up thinking that the age of religion had passed. I think there was a conceit from the last century, which I think students coming to college don't share. But many of the faculty that we have may have grown up in that context. And the idea was that religion was a kind of necessary, as you suggest, glue for community based on a variety of implausible beliefs in a metaphysical universe, in a divine presence, and so forth and so on, that were somehow temporary placeholders for an increasingly expanding world of science that would explain or illuminate the nature of the universe and life without reference to a parallel metaphysical reality that might parallel thoughts about mind and body, soul and body. The thing, of course, that of this, a belief in the secularization of the way we think about the world, seems never to have taken into account are two things which are relevant to this pandemic. One is that to explain how the world works, as you suggest, doesn't necessarily lead you to a position against religion. You take a pantheistic view, that nature and God are one, the kind of view that Spinoza had, and you might come up and say, well, this is perfectly understandable, whether it's evolution or whether it's the human genome or whether it is the Big Bang theory. Whatever scientists find plausible by evidence through empirical knowledge is completely compatible with some kind of framework. But I think the things that were not anticipated is in the face of our own mortality, which of course we're confronted with this pandemic, and in the face of suffering, how do you construct meaning? You can tell someone from a philosophical point of view that asking about whether God exists is an unnecessary question. I'm an agnostic, which means when I'm watching a tennis match between believers and non-believers whose rules I don't understand, I don't know why they're playing the game in the first place, because I'm relatively tone deaf to questions that existentially seem to me unnecessary, questions that I don't lose any sleep over. I was once sitting on a terrace. As Shai knows, I served as a music director of the Radio Orchestra of Israel, the Jerusalem Symphony, so I was in Israel on a regular basis, and I was sitting with a friend of mine who teaches at Columbia, and he was doing some recruiting for Columbia University, and he turned to me. We've known each other a long time. He said, do you ever stop to think about ultimate questions? Now we're looking over the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. And I think he was sort of flabbergasted when I said, no, I don't actually lose any sleep about those questions. But I recognize that having grown up among people who survived the Holocaust, that suffering, human suffering, and death, are frightening and mysterious and inexplicable on some level. And meaning, if you're a young person going to college in a pandemic, you ask, why should I go to college? What's the point? And if in fact I can a way to eat, why work? Why have ambition? Why study? I might be able to form a community on a simpler basis. I might decide that it's my ethnic identity, or it's my the color of my skin, or my neighborhood, or the language I speak. The interesting and fascinating thing about religion is that it's impressive the amount of thought people have given to helping people come to terms with what seems to have no rational explanation. And so I think the power of religion is in the provocative way it can get people to think about the meaning of their lives, so to speak, in a blunt way. And in Bard's case, the interesting thing is that we've always held on to the recognition that the institution had its origins in a religious tradition. It was founded by the Episcopal Church. We actually are responsible for running a parish. And I think what's great about the current situation in a positive way is that we have gone beyond the period of arrogance, of secularization. The fact is that if you thought, well, people who are religious must be simply superstitious. Well, we know in the Jewish tradition and the Islamic tradition, the great scholars are religious. So you can't simply write it off as kind of placeholder for ignorance. If you only told them this. Now, the fundamentalist religions, of course, are more complex. Why intelligent people would believe, as you suggest, things that are not true, even in the eyes of God, if one thought about God. So if God had eyes, which I'm not sure God has eyes, but we have in the United States a university president, Jerry Falwell, right, who doesn't want to accept the science of the transmission of disease. And a lot of people are sick and might die. He may, in fact, hide behind a conspiracy theory that all of this is either isn't true, or that in the end there will be some kind of transcendent religious rescue package that will come down from some proverbial heaven. And he just is wrong, and he's putting a lot of people at risk. So the question is, of course, for those of us who are not religious, it's interesting to debate the people who are, because at the end, the thing that interests me as well and will be important for the pandemic, post-pandemic society is on whose rules do we organize ourselves and govern ourselves? Divine rules? Is it a bunch of rabbis or imams or priests or the Pope? Or do we get to decide for ourselves using our human reason without an appeal to some divine authority? And we will have to rethink how we do our democracy in the face of what we've learned in this pandemic, presence of technology. Does Congress have to be in Washington, in its seats, in order to have its legal right to govern? Or is this an excuse to say, well, democracy just doesn't work? What we need is either a benign authoritarian figure like Governor Cuomo, whom people sort of, it's like the Pope's lesson at 11 o'clock, that's all we need. That's what we need to govern. Or the president, take the opposite.
So some would argue that actually looking to these figures, these big men, as if they are supposed to save us is also an old religious habit.
A bad
that might
one.
be there.
A totally
Correct.
bad one.
Yes.
I'm sympathetic to some forms of practice of Judaism that push against the modernization of Judaism, that turn the American rabbi into the moral equivalent of a priest, so that he or she can put clergy on their car window. They're not clergy in reality. They don't carry any special messages between ourselves and some divine space. And so the idea of a kind of almost pagan idea of a god, or an authority that's more than human. But I think the study of religion, for a student coming to college today, is far more important than it was, I think, in the generations of their parents or grandparents. Because so many more people adhere with such loyalty to the community of religious faith. And the conversation has broken down. We don't really know how to talk to someone who is of radically different beliefs. Even within religious community, in our own religious community, the Jewish community, civility and conversation between all kinds of people who consider themselves Jewish has broken down. The same thing is in Islam, and the same thing is in Christianity. So an Episcopalian of a relatively non-Anglo-Catholic tradition has a hell of a time, so to speak, talking to somebody who is either an evangelical believer or is perhaps belongs to a more conservative Catholic tradition. And the controversial issues. So we have there's a real revival of religion as people have tried to solve the question of how do I construct meaning for myself and for my community.
That's right. So it's certainly a site where a discipline of study or a topic of study where we can learn about the other and various others. But one of the, I think, most fascinating things about the study of religion, particularly at moments of crisis or even evil, is whether even people who don't share the metaphysics of the text that they're studying have what to learn. I often think of one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, Gershom Scholem, who was known as the scholar who virtually invented the academic study of Jewish mysticism. But he was also known as someone who was able to bring what seemed and in fact was pure obscurity into a conversation with great Western thinkers and also with the moment. And one of the things that he located in this tradition, particularly in the Zohar, which is sort of the Jewish mystics' Bible, is the centrality of evil and the lack of apologetics about evil in the world. That in fact, evil is located somehow at the very heart of what the mystics call the Godhead. So this is not something that is sort of external to God, but almost a Gnostic idea that evil is real and it's located at sort of the most basic aspects of reality. And I recently came across a passage that is concerned with pandemics or plague. It's about a scene in the Hebrew Bible where the priest Aaron runs throughout the Israelite camp with incense to stop a plague. And the Zohar reads this as trying to counteract some sort of evil mechanism known as the other side in God. Now, this is something that seems entirely pagan, not just to atheists, but even to many religious Jews. But at the same time, there is a compelling, or at least provocative, image there of not apologizing for evil, not apologizing for bad, but actually thinking through how it can coexist with God and with the divine.
Well, I want to pick up on your thought that reading these texts is provocative and important in difficult times. So the difference of opinion, of course, is that one doesn't have to construct a notion of the divine that incorporates evil. So someone like myself who functions absent that kind of metaphysical world, to me, evil seems a human characteristic that is not something that I would think is get riddable of, and therefore is in the world. It is. And I rather it not be justified by being part of some kind of complex notion of the divine. It's completely human, and it's my responsibility as a human being to combat it. That's why we have both prisons, and that's why we have a prison initiative at Bard. That's why we have crime and we have punishment. That it is our responsibility. That the way I read the metaphor of the tale of human creation is that we are given, in exchange for our mortality, the responsibility and freedom to create human history, and we're responsible for curtailing evil and containing it. And the Holocaust is a human failure, it's not a divine responsibility. And our ability to tolerate discrimination, poverty, pain, and suffering unnecessarily, that there are things we can't do, but there are things we could do. Take this pandemic. I'd rather not talk about the divine and talk about the incompetence of governance. The fact that we lived, in an illusion in which our leadership, George W. Bush was warning about pandemics, and yet we had a government that a large portion of our fellow citizens don't believe the nation should have health care, without realizing that if your neighbor doesn't have health care, you're at risk. That's not about a giveaway. It's about a self-protection. The idea that we don't have a national healthcare system, that we're totally unprepared in testing. We had no idea what we were doing, and we were misled. And yet government is not our enemy. Private enterprise is not going to help us. Big pharma is not going to help us. So there has to be a collaborative way we deal with this. And this evil of fear and death, and all the economic consequences, is a human factor. What's interesting is that there are some things that have to be lived with without necessarily agreeing on their explanation. So you talk about the Zohar. I recently, in my field at Bard, which is music, we're preparing for our annual music festival, which is always on a subject. And this year's subject is the French composer and musician Nadia Boulanger, arguably the most important music teacher of the 20th century. And she was a very devout French Catholic. And there's a story that she tells when Elliott Carter, the American composer, was a student of hers. And two of America's most distinguished African-American composers studied with her, George Walker and Julia Perry. And as did Aaron Copland. She gave Elliott Carter a book she called her favorite book, which was the Pensées of Pascal. Jansenist philosopher of the 17th century, and his book Thoughts, Pensées, is one of the great classics of French thought. And it's a very grim, it's a view of the human condition as being derived from original sin and wretched, yet at the same time, and faith in God and reason are not reconciled, but they live in the same box, if you will. And it's interesting to read it, and try to understand her thoughts. What is music? What's music? What are the arts? The arts are useless, which is one of their great virtues. Right? And so what are we doing making art? People are dying, people are poor, people are ill, people are oppressed. Are we fiddling while Rome burns? This kind of idea. Well, what's fascinating is she found in theology a justification for the creation of meaning for the expression of the human. And in her sense, it was also the expression of the immortality of the soul, which was part of a metaphysical world out there, which was created by God, based on a duality of our mind and body. Now, you don't have to go through that line of thought to come up with a conclusion that we have some kind of divine gift. And the gift of learning and the gift of the imagination, of the creation of art, is a reminder of the sanctity of our own life. that there's no life that's superfluous or can be done away with, or it doesn't matter how many bodies are in a morgue because of a coronavirus. That we have some responsibility, reciprocal responsibility, to the person next to us. What in your tradition, my tradition, Martin Buber would have called the I-thou relationship, not I-it. It's not how much money I have in my back pocket, but it's my reciprocal relationship to another human being or to nature or something. Well, thinking about meaning, these religious texts are hugely provocative. I found myself reading Pascal, which I hadn't read since I was an undergraduate. I never had any reason to, but here is this is this person's favorite book, and I have to write about this person. So you got to figure out why it's her favorite book, and I found myself immensely engrossed in how sophisticated and helpful. But I think the big difference between the religious and the non-religious may be that to take the problem of evil and withdraw it from the exclusive domain of the human has I was never satisfied that when I would see someone suffer or die, someone might say, well, that's God's will. That's where I take exception.
Sure. Yes, and that obscure or strange text that I mentioned, of course, is just one view among countless views. So I think we might bring the conversation to a close, but I did just want to follow up with one more thing that you mentioned, which is in the work of Pascal, or this application, where we see sort of music, the arts, and religion come together. One of the legal questions that governments around the world have been posing, and this is particularly vital in the American context, is what is considered to be a vital activity.
Essential, yes. Yeah.
Essential activity. And religion, apparently, at least in its public performed way, as well as music, gathering for the arts, museums, have not been seen as entirely essential. And most aficionados and religion believers are happy to accept at least this temporary measure that we can't go to the concert halls, we can't go to the churches to gather. But at the same time, I think both the world of the arts and religion, the response would be that while we might not be an essential activity during a plague, we're also not just mere diversion or entertainment. That there's something essential about our human spirit that happens in the arts, that happens in religious learning and practice, that hopefully we'll soon get to see, and certainly we will get to see reemerge when the concert halls can fill up again, and also the houses of religious learning.
Yeah. So, yes, and I think that's very eloquently said. People listening to this should know that for all the discussion of religion, that one need not be religious to be a student at Bard, and most, I think, of our students are either silently non-religious or tacitly religious. So, and we, although born into a Christian tradition, we are completely non-sectarian. So, so no one should feel that we're anything different about that. But your point is crucial, because the one thing that religion and the arts have in common is that they're human activities that adapt technology. They're not replaced by technology. So, yes, you can pray over Zoom, right? You can have communion over Zoom, right? But that isn't really what the religious experience is about, right? And for those of our musicians, there is no such thing as doing an opera or a concert, or a Mahler symphony, or on the machine. The same is with teaching and learning. People say, well, will people go back to college after this? Absolutely. The thing that we feel from our students is the sudden recognition that, wonderful, I'm so glad I can see Shai. So it's a pleasure to see him. Is it better than not talking to him at all? Is it better than a letter that took 2 weeks to get to him or from him, even though he was writing me from around the corner? Probably yes. Is it better than, a messenger on a horse? Probably, right? Is it better than the telegraph and the telephone? Yes. Is it better than a videotaped message? Yes. So is Zoom, Blue Jeans, Google Meet, is it an advance of civilization? Yes. But is it a replacement? It's a useful thing in my toolbox. But teaching and learning is still in real time with your classmates, with your peers, and with teachers, and with developing relationships. That music recorded is terrific, but it's no replacement for the acoustic experience of sitting on the stage with your neighbor. And so it reminds us, this form of imprisonment reminds us of how stable some fundamentally human transactions are. And as you suggest, being in a community, sharing beliefs, being in a community, learning, and being in a community, listening and performing, whether it's a dance or theater or music, is we have learned to cherish. They become more essential because they were deemed inessential.
That's right. And on that note, I really look forward to being able to be in your office, in your study, conversing
Yours,
in
yes.
person and not just virtually.
And
Thanks
stay
so much.
well. Okay.
Yes, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.